Morning. I think we have everybody inside now. How we doing, Jeff? You rolling everybody inside? There we go. Close the doors. Keep them in here. I'm head of the co-head with my wife of the parents committee, so this is my chance to collect. Fair warning. More formally, I'm Chris Henneman. As I mentioned, my wife and I, Jane, are excited to be back on campus for the winter Parents Weekend. It's a fantastic crowd. Obviously, the chill in the air usually thins things out a little bit from the fall, but this is an exceptional turnout. So it's great to see everybody's faces for another great weekend. Hopefully everybody enjoyed the experience this morning. This is our 8th consecutive year at Taft. I feel like I'm going here by now. I'm waiting to see what my grades are going to be like. We've had the pleasure to work with the school through 3 of our children. Our son Patrick is upper mid currently, and then we've had 2 graduates, Henry, who graduated in 19, and Emma graduated in 21. As an introduction to the Parents Fund, if you're not familiar with it, it's a critical source of funding supplementing the Taft Fund to support the school's nearly $50 million annual operating budget, which cannot be sustained on tuition alone. Gifts to the Parents Fund directly impact Taft's ability to recruit and retain some of the highest caliber faculty and coaches, as hopefully everybody had a chance to experience this morning. It also provides an incredible array of academic and extracurricular activities and attract the best student body possible to keep Taft dynamic and a diverse community. Taft's annual support comes from 3 important sources: current parents, former parents and grandparents, and alumni. Participation continues to be the hallmark of the Parents Fund and its success. Parent support at Taft not only enhances the lives of each student in a direct and immediate way, but also is one of the school's most impressive credentials. For 30 years, Taft has maintained over a 90% parent participation rate. And even given the year that we had, and I'll just give you a personal note, clearly going off script. We had the privilege to lead the Parents Committee, and it's an exceptional year for us to be doing this, and we respect the privilege to be part of the school in transition, which has completely impressed us. This school has great leadership, and it's a transition year, and has done an exceptional job. When you're head of the Parents Committee for your first round, that's a daunting environment to basically be part of the Parents Fund, and I've been only impressed with it. And I hope I can express that to the people here, and you embrace the same strength of leadership that the school has for our children. And even over the past year, we've had a very unique environment, and so that puts unique challenges on everybody economically. And I think one of the most impressive things that I can mention about the results for the last year is that the parents' participation rate to date, actually frankly to the end of the year, was up 2% versus the previous year, which was a high watermark. So an exceptionally impressive statistic in terms of just continue to participate from the parent community. So we're extremely happy that we get the sponsorship for the Parents Fund. Clearly we hope that continues. We've still got work to do. Again, I think reflective of the environment, we're a little behind in terms of absolute funding, but actually we've seen a good pickup, obviously, as we turn the corner from 2022 into 2023, and expect that and hope that momentum continues. Just a few comments on the Parents Committee itself. It is comprised of 60 families who do volunteer their time to educate parents and encourage your participation for the Parents Fund. So your support ensures that Taft education remains a great value. So when you're contacted by somebody from the Parents Fund, please be responsive. They do volunteer their time. It does take effort, and I appreciate everybody's and help and contributions to that. So thank you for your time today and in advance of supporting the Parents Fund. And I do get a very unique honor. It's an honor and a privilege. After 22 years, I get to actually introduce Willy, who has done such a great job leading the school. These are well-participated or well-anticipated comments. So I get to introduce Willy for his last winter Parent Speak discussion. Thank you.
Well, good morning, all of you. And I hope you had a great morning of classes. I did have a number of teachers, a number of parents admit they had no idea of what was going on in class. But I'm really glad to see you all here. And as I've said this before, I love the opportunity to offer remarks. I take it seriously. I think you deserve to hear my thinking on something. I never would be comfortable with simply giving you a welcome and stepping off the stage. I inherited a tradition from my predecessor, Lance Odden, who I think was the finest head in the business. And he also took advantage of this moment over the years, in his 29 years, to talk about an issue. So I'm going to do that today. And the title of this talk is, as you could see from the handout, Ideas and Ideals, a Portrait and a Forgotten School. It's a talk in 5 chapters. And the first chapter is called, Here's a Question. And here's the question. Is it possible that a school can have such a profound effect on its students that for all their individual diversity, they would share some common enduring qualities? That is, that you could almost recognize them. So that's the question I'm asking. And my answer, as you would guess, is yes. And it's rooted not just in my hopes and dreams, idealistic as they may be, even innocent, but also in 3 things I want to talk about here. So I think the answer is yes to that question. Can we create enduring qualities that will mark a graduate forever? I think it's shaped in the beliefs that Horace Taft had himself in founding the school. So that's first. Second, in a document that you're holding in your hand that was created by the faculty 2 decades ago. And third, in a story about a school that is completely forgotten. So chapter 2, Horace Taft, Ideas and Ideals. Now, it shouldn't surprise you if we look for evidence that Taft, the school, could create a graduate with common traits. We would find it in Horace Taft himself. A place to start would be his decision to even found the school. Why even do such a thing as audacious? Why even take this on if you didn't believe that you were in the business of changing lives? He absolutely had to think like this. And even in his first chaotic years, and they were in those early days of the school, he was untried, and the success of the school was not sure. Even in those years, you can tell that he was beginning to form a coherent philosophy on what we might today call educational outcomes. He never used language like that, but we can see him doing this. Here's a reflection from his autobiography entitled Memories and Opinions. And he wrote this, and he's writing this of his very early days. One thing cheered me mightily. I suppose that nothing pleased me so much in my plan for a boys' school as the idea that I might be a lay preacher. The association with boys would give me opportunity for influencing their ideas and ideals. I began to think that I was achieving some results that had nothing to do with the marking book or the college examinations. And in some ways, it's all there, isn't it? Clearly, he's working towards a mission statement, the education of the whole student. And he's pointing to what he hopes his graduates will carry with them. The phrase ideas and ideals suggests that the school is going to do more than teach towards a test and towards getting good scores on college placement. It is, to be sure, a place of intellectual enlightenment. That's the ideas part. But it's equally to be about a place of the development of certain ways of thinking and acting and being. And that's the ideals. And Taft himself believed, and I think he believed very deeply, that his school would leave students changed, different, carrying enduring qualities. And so for the next 4 decades of his headship, his school was constantly working towards those twin goals of ideas and ideals. And so Taft graduates carried important lessons, important ideas and ideals on service and honor and kindness and hard work and respect and humility. So I think from the very start, this school rested on the convictions that graduates, for all their individual differences, would have a common experience and maybe even share some common qualities. I'm guessing Taft might have even hoped that you could recognize them. You'd recognize them. They went to Taft. Chapter 3, Creating the Portrait. If you look at our work today, and you saw it today, you see the same conviction that a Taft education has unique, clear, and specific objectives, which we hope and we expect will mark graduates forever. And for the evidence of this, you need look no further than the program that's in your hand. And the back side was that document entitled The Portrait of the Graduate. And I hope when you look at that, and you probably looked as you came in, I hope that you look at that and you begin to recognize your own child. The POG, as we call it, is perhaps the most important statement we have here, and you should understand its history. So back in 2001, when I was appointed head, we undertook a really important inquiry as a faculty. I think it coincided with me being new, but more importantly, it coincided with the new century. And a lot of institutions and organizations sort of took that moment for institutional reflection. We knew what our mission was, but we wanted to ask the question, what does the education of the whole student look like in the new century? And since at the time there was a trend called backward design, there's a trend in education which essentially asserted in any educational exercise, begin with what you want at the end. Begin with the outcomes and design everything backwards from that. It's called this backward design. And so we asked a more explicit and follow-up question, and it was this. What are the skills, habits, and understandings that we want our graduates to have when they leave Taft? Now that, I think, is a really good and interesting question. Again, what are the skills, habits, and understandings we want our students to have? And we believed as a faculty that if we could answer that question, in essence, we would have a picture of what the graduate would look like. There you have it, right? We would have a portrait, and it would be uniquely Taft. And what we did was every department asked that question, English department, math, science, and so on. They asked, what does a graduate of our curriculum look like? I assume that the English department had some language like an understanding of the way rhetorical devices are used for linguistic effect, and maybe the science department had something about the respect for scientific inquiry, what have you. And then if I use an outdated metaphor, we stacked them up like transparencies for an overhead projector, and we looked for commonalities. We looked for the things that kept coming up over and over again, and what we found became the portrait. That's what you're holding in your hand. And as I have said, we have nailed it, almost Martin Luther-like in our passion, on real and figurative doors. You see it on the website, the bulletin board, plenty of offices. It is framed on my mantelpiece. I suspect it'll be there long after I leave. We regularly re-examine it, and it guides absolutely everything we do, everything. Charges of an ad hoc committee, internal policies, board of trustees conversations. It guides everything. And in the end, it's the evidence of a really important claim, that the mission and culture and curriculum and structure and practices and architecture and value and policies, that all of that, the entire experience that your son or daughter has here, is going to create something that they will carry forever. They're changed. They have something in common with others that can be identified. They went to Taft. Maybe you can even tell. And it is a really audacious goal. It's a brave hope, and it's one I will never give up. Chapter 4, 2 men boxing and a forgotten school. History actually gives us better evidence of the impact of a school, and it comes in the story of an Irish immigrant named John McMullen, and yes, you recognize the name, who founded and ran a school about 150 years ago. It is a story I've never told before, but perhaps in my final words to you, this is the time to tell it. It's one I know well because it was told to me by my late father about my great-grandfather in a beautifully researched essay that he wrote, which I treasure and informs much of this talk. And the story reveals the enduring power of a school. I guess it also tells you that if I have a dream that Taft is going to change students forever, at least I come by it naturally. Now, the essay begins with the strangest of scenes of 2 men with boxing gloves punching each other in a padded room. It was January 1899 in Albany, and Teddy Roosevelt, age 41, the newly elected governor, is in the governor's mansion. His younger friend, Gifford Pinchot, who would become the first leader of the U.S. Forest Service, 2-time governor of Pennsylvania, and generally seen as the absolute pioneer, the beginner of the modern environmental movement, was visiting him. And the 2 men shared a deep interest in the wilderness. It's impossible not to think of them at the governor's house, not talking about public stewardship, forest management, environmental policy. But that's not all they did that day. For some reason, they also wanted to punch each other. And here's Pinchot in his autobiography. TR and I did a little wrestling, at which he beat me. And then some boxing, during which I had the honor of knocking the future President of the United States off his very solid pins. And it is a wonderful, absurd comic scene, and you're wondering what it has to do with anything, but you'll see. And my father writes in this essay, why and how on earth did two grown men ever come to blows in this friendly fashion? To this question, part of the answer can be found in TR and Pinchot's shared experience at a school in New York bearing the name of its headmaster, John McMullen. And the essay argues quite convincingly that the scene serves as a kind of symbolic proof that it was the experience each man had at their time in this school, which meant they came to acquire and carry forever some shared sensibilities and habits and beliefs. In short, John McMullen School provides a clear yes to our question. And here's the story. So at some date unknown, it seems to be somewhere around 1800, my great-grandfather, John McMullen, and it was spelled with an MC, not an MAC, emigrated from Ballymoney, Ireland to New York, marrying another Irish immigrant named Lucinda Civil in 1807. We know very little about him. There is a print notice that he was a, quote, grocer. We know that he had 9 children, his son John born in 1818. And John clearly must have been precociously bright. He attended Columbia University, graduated in 1837. 3 years later, graduated with a master's in library science. And though relatively poor, he was clearly becoming a man of letters. He had been selected to be the celebratory poet for graduation. He was on the commencement committee. He had been inducted into one of the literary societies. And after graduation, with the financial help of a prominent family, there was the kind of obligatory grand tour of Europe, visiting most of it walking, the historical sites, perhaps meeting important people with letters of introduction from this family. And at the next point, at some point in the next decade, he changed the spelling of his name to the Mac, the M-A-C, clearly done in response to the anti-Irish, no Irish need apply sentiment. I don't know exactly when that happened. It's a little bit unclear. We don't know much about his years in that decade. It seems he tutored a bit. There's a reference to trying his hand at a Western college of no name we know. He wrote a bit. And then in 1852, he opened his own school. A printed brochure shows the endorsements of some prominent New Yorkers, including the president of Columbia, but it failed miserably. The experiment lasted just 2 years. A few years later, he tried again with 40 students, and this too failed. But then in 1859, something clicked. The lessons of failure came together. And until 1890, when he closed the doors, he was the school, and an important school it was. 2 years later, his school, generally called Professor McMullen School or Professor McMullen's Academy, was formally closed. He was 74. He had taught about 700 students in those 3 decades, among them boys of some of the city's most prominent and influential families. Clearly, he had been doing something right. By happy chance, the school was located, initially, close to the homes of 2 Roosevelts, Theodore Sr. and Robert, on 20th. And then 10 years later, he was on 30th, respectability having moved uptown. And that's where Roosevelt and Pinchot, the 2 men we met boxing, would enroll. Now, some of you may know, and you've read biographies, you would know that, of course, Roosevelt went to Harvard and Pinchot Yale. We know that Pinchot eventually went to Phillips Exeter, but as many of you know, Roosevelt was a very sickly boy. He was taught at home for most of his youth. That much we know. You can find that easily. But if you brush away at the history of these 2 men, you uncover something, and something else emerges. They both attended McMullen School. Roosevelt from 1868 to 69, and Pinchot from 76 to 80. Roosevelt mentions this in his autobiography, Boyhood and Education, speaking of his months at, quote, Professor McMullen's School on 20th Street. It's referred elsewhere, I found in another source, Professor McMullen's Academy near Madison Square. We know much more about Gifford Pinchot because he had 4 years there. And from the start, McMullen School had 3 clear elements sought by families of the time, and clearly it was sought after, given the numbers I gave you in the years it was in session. First, it was a rather typical, robust, classical education. And you know what that means. It meant several language instruction, including Latin and Greek, and then English, science, history, and math. So that was the first part of it, a classic liberal arts, rigorous classical education. Second, it was shaped by an unshakable conviction in the benefits of the outdoors generally, and then the wilderness specifically. And then third, an almost evangelical passion for physical exercise, in particular martial sports, wrestling, boxing, fencing. We might think of these as forming the elements for his own portrait of the graduate. And so it is no wonder that Roosevelt and Pinchot, after perhaps talking about wilderness conservation, would look at each other after their evening cigar and say, how about a little boxing? They carried their school with them. So the classical curriculum came, of course, from his education at Columbia. There was no question he was a profoundly learned man. He was inducted into the Century Club, of course, the Century Club, the club for men of letters, intelligentsia. He would serve as a leader and the librarian. He was asked for advice on all kinds of scholarly matters. So there's no question that that classical curriculum was part of the school. His passion for the outdoors was also not unusual. As some of you know, part of the late 19th century Romantic movement that had its writers and poets and artists and practitioners who saw the wilderness something beautiful and worthy of celebration and preservation. He was a wilderness lover. My father and I have seen these diary entries and know about him. And a tireless walker. He once noted in a diary that he was embarrassed that they had not really gotten to the 30-mile mark on a single day. He hiked everywhere. Europe, Adirondacks, the Poconos, the Green Mountains. He once walked from Hoboken to Albany, and that would be 150 miles if you stayed on I-87. He twice ventured down the wilds of the Susquehanna River, weeks at a time, once with a colleague, and I know this is scary, with 2 students. Another time he walked and paddled south for over 100 miles from Long Lake in upstate New York, nearly starving until a family of Mohawks gave him food in a canoe, which he took. He was fascinated by natural systems. He was troubled by the lack of preservation and the overharvesting in forest lands. And my father argues, in short, that he was a pioneer as an environmentalist. And that perspective shaped much of his school, which I find fascinating, that a school on the Upper East Side, or the Lower East Side, would actually care deeply about the wilderness. But in that regard, he found 2 really eager students in Pinchot and Roosevelt. And there is no doubt that their views on conservation were fundamentally shaped by their days at Macmillan School. Both of them loved the natural world. Roosevelt, the boy, as some of you may know from biographies, had his own museum in his childhood home. He learned how to collect and preserve specimens. In all likelihood, he brought home a pamphlet from the Smithsonian on taxidermy, which Professor McMullen would give to interested students. Pinchot, too, was influenced by McMullen and found a passion for the natural world. Indeed, several letters that he wrote to the headmaster still exist. And one of them has got this typical that I find deeply charming. My dear teacher, you can imagine the 12-year-old boy writing this. My dear teacher, I want to tell you something about my collection of insects. This is the 2nd year I've been at it. I have almost 200 specimens, and when you think of how many there are, this is very few. But I still have more than I thought I had when I began. And I don't confine myself strictly to these, but also take all the little curiosities I can find. I have 2 very nice fossils. I mean, that's a 12-year-old writing to his head. Both men became prophets of wilderness and preservation, and their lifelong friendship was clearly based on their love of outdoors. Their very public identities, and indeed their legacies, shared individually and communally, were shaped by this passion. You will find scores of pictures of them in national parks and forests, wool pants, packs, boots, horses. Their individual and shared impact on American conservation policy cannot be overstated. A quick review of contemporary book titles makes my point. The Naturalist, Teddy Roosevelt and a Lifetime of Exploration. The Wilderness Warrior, Teddy Roosevelt and the Crusade for America. Roosevelt the Explorer, TR's Amazing Adventures as Naturalist Conservation Explorer. Gifford Pinchot, The Making of Modern Environmentalism. The Conservation Diaries of Gifford Pinchot, Natural Rivals, John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, and the Creation of America's Public Lands. If you consult any top 10 list of the most important conservationists in our nation's history, you will find those two names. The president most known in our history for wilderness conservation, and the man who's seen generally as the founder of modern environmentalism. And it seems impossible not to draw a line straight back to their years under the tutelage of this Professor McMullen. And the answer to our question, the initial question, gets more and more clear. But it only gets more compelling when we think of the third aspect of the school. There is no line straighter back to their school days than the love of exercise. Indeed, when Roosevelt was later partially blinded in a boxing match in the White House with a friend who was a general at the time, we now know who to blame. McMullen's championing of physical culture was absolutely well known, and it was part of the marketing of this school. That is, whatever you think of this school and what its essence is, I will tell you that a family in 1860, 70, 80, 90 knew that the McMullen School, this championing of martial arts in particular, led the list. The school curriculum included, he used the word gymnastics, but it included boxing, wrestling, and something frankly I did not know about. It's called single stick, which is a martial arts weapon that looks like a combination between a broomstick and a wooden sword, which by 1879, by the way, he was forced to charge an additional $18 a year for parents for instruction. The curriculum was a signature, and even in an obituary I found in an educational journal in 1896, it noted, quote, and this is in the obit, Mr. McMullen himself gave drills in single sticks, boxing, fencing, and encouraged outdoor play. He is, I suspect, the last McMullen to have that sentence in an obit. In an essay published in the Evening Post in the late 1870s, and of course the Evening Post, arguably the most read publication at the time, he wrote in his essay, and here you will cringe, quote, there is no stronger bond between a teacher and his students than exercise makes. Again, he said between teachers and students. Peevishness and restlessness are done away with. Unlimited boxing produce a very different atmosphere. That being the understatement of his history. He is clearly boxing with his students. When Roosevelt's nervous little brother, Elliot, who did not want to go to the school, came on what sounds to me like a campus admissions tour, McMullen wrote, and this is a direct recollection of the day when Teddy Roosevelt brought his younger brother. I love this scene. This is McMullen writing. I equipped him with a tiny pair of gloves, and myself sitting on a low platform, pointed to the center of my forehead. I told him to hit me there as hard as he could. He hit me very gently, of course, but I pretended to go over somewhat. And telling him to hit me harder each time, you can see the scene, I went over further and further, enjoying in the meantime the brightness of his face until by the time he knocked over the schoolmaster, his whole countenance was beaming with delight, and his notions about school were evidently revolutionized. I love the scene and wonder about the list of Tafties who would like to have me on the receiving end. I wonder, you should ask Peter Frew if he would like to add this to the admissions tour. So there, in that apartment, Elliot's older brother, the sickly, spindly Teddy, was homeschooled. Perhaps exercise would help, the family doctor said. A room in the apartment was turned into a gym, but Teddy needed routine, support, training. 7 Roosevelts had either been or were currently enrolled at the school. And so off Teddy went, little Elliot in tow. McMullen wrote of the Roosevelts, quote, the father wished to leave Teddy at school only as long as he was able to endure it. This is the father of a deeply sick boy. I gradually persuaded them both to take boxing lessons, and a dozen lessons had good effect. And good effect it did, indeed permanent effect. As a president years later, Roosevelt was well known for his love of boxing and single stick, and the press ate it up. He was forever punching and whacking and fencing. He sometimes would wrap a mattress around his torso for padding. There's a famous Harper's Weekly image of him battling a colleague in the upper rooms of the executive mansion, each man holding what looks like a wooden sword with a mask on, and they're beating each other. And the New York Times was once actually forced to publish an explanatory piece about a particular bout he had with his friend General Wood, quote, and this is in the Times, "As a result, the president wears a bruise on his forehead over his left eye." They had to publicize this. Pinchot never forgot his lessons as well. He played football at Yale. We can find references to him boxing and fencing in graduate school. Of course, increasingly, his love of exercise became more outdoor. So these two men serve as evidence of the power of the school, the permanency of its effect. I'm guessing that if you met a McMullen graduate, let's say in 1880, on the street, perhaps at the table of the Century Club, you might recognize him. He had a classical scholarly education. He believed in the benefits of the wilderness and the importance of conservation, and he saw value in physical exertion. Not every student, of course, but many, and maybe even most. And in my mind, the lines back to their professor in that school are really clear. In these two graduates, my father argued in the essay, there was, quote, an active synergy of values which made socio-cultural history. McMullen's curriculum, its particular teachings, serve as an indicator of certain lines of force at the time, and it helped set trends in America's largest city. Ultimately, I might argue, trends in our nation. Now, let me be clear, and with the obvious bias I have. My point is not to claim that the school was either good or bad. That's for history to judge. It's for those families who went there. But it is to suggest that this comic scene of two men boxing, what it does tell us is something really, really important, that a good school with coherence and confidence in its curricula, and with the right faculty, and an aligned culture, and a compelling mission, all of that can lead to a graduate with vital shared habits and qualities that they carry for a lifetime. And that's not a bad thing to be remembered for. So chapter the last, it's an act of faith. But this is clear to you all. If we didn't believe this, if we didn't believe that a school could have this lasting effect, why would we enter the profession in the first place? Such dreaming is a job requirement of a teacher and a headmaster. We hope our students carry lessons forever. We think we're changing lives. Every teacher thinks that. It is their life's purpose. I think we teachers are innocent. Our dreams are as great as a child's. So I came here some 40 years ago, and I forgot to leave because I sensed there was something at this school that was as mysterious and magical as alchemy, as powerful and permanent as gravity. There was something unique to this place, these tiled halls and the bricked walls, right? That emerald-stretched quad or that sloping green hill. And if that reveals an idealism in me, blame it on the son of an Irish immigrant who founded a school on his third try. So it may be that there's some combination of hubris and innocence that lets me believe that what happens here, what you are witnessing today, the desperate passion and fierce commitment of teachers, the elastic breadth and probing depth of the curriculum, the astonishing talent and breathtaking diversity of the community, the enduring power of central values and beliefs, the solemn beauty of a campus that brings us together. There's some combination of all this. We believe it will change your children and leave them with something shared. Make them recognizable as Taft graduates as Roosevelt and Pinchot were of Professor McMullen's. Prepare them to lead and serve. Maybe have them look something like that portrait that you hold in your hands. This I've always believed, always will, and surely lesser enterprises have rested on greater vanities. In 1890, the same year, literally the same year that Taft started his own school, Professor McMullen was slowly closing his. The campus had become a rented apartment building far uptown in the 150s, enrollment dwindling to 9, and then finally just 1. There were other competing schools. He was getting on in age, his repute fading. He had raised a family, including a son who would hold me in his arms in 1960. John McMullen was buried on September 15th, 1896, at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. Obviously, I never knew him, but you can tell what his legacy means to me. Just a couple years after he shuttered his school. And my uncle, my brother, and older son carry his name. So something lasts. And in an obituary penned by a member of the Century Club noted, it reads an excerpt, "For nearly 40 years, he conducted a boys' school in the city, numbering among his pupils many of the most prominent and distinguished men who will bear witness to his worth and high character, the originality of his methods, the thoroughness of his instruction, his earnest devotion to calling, his intelligence and appreciation of the work he had to do brought him distinction and merited success." And that is not a bad legacy for any other school, much less the son of a grocer had to change the spelling of his name. And what I wonder about is, did John McMullen ever marvel at his legacy? I think probably not. That's not the way teachers tend to think. And no one remembers his school. He never penned a portrait of the graduate that still remained tattered and tacked on some closed door. He didn't live long enough to hear of the scene of Roosevelt and Pincho's impromptu boxing match. He never bore witness to their distinguished lives of public service, how their commitment to conservation changed the destiny of a nation. He never once, I'm sure, heard them give a speech about how their days on the campus changed them, but that happens at a good school. We don't always get to see what we wrought. It's all of it, an act of faith, a life of hope and dreaming, and there is peace and satisfaction for any headmaster in accepting that. And so it's with that and great thanks for all you do for the school and with the hope that you have a wonderful day. Welcome to Taft. Thanks so much.